I didn't want to go. That's the truth. But Camille gave me that look, the kind that doesn't ask, doesn't plead, doesn't threaten. It just expects. And it's always the quiet expectations that dig the deepest. That's how I found myself driving through the winding roads of Durham, past the old brick storefronts and the university clock tower, headed straight into a gathering I had no interest in attending. Camille's family reunion wasn't just a reunion. They never were. Her mother, Judith, called them reunions, but they were performances. Annual theater productions where every detail was a prop meant to remind everyone who they were supposed to be. This year, the script had a new star, Camille's little sister, Ivy, the newly minted Harvard admittee. There would be speeches, probably a cake, definitely too many camera flashes, and at least one unsolicited story from Uncle Reuben about how hard work always pays off. I could recite the entire thing by heart, and I hadn't even parked the car yet. I glanced at Camille in the passenger seat. She was fixing her earring, eyes focused on the reflection in the visor mirror. Her silence wasn't cold, it was practiced, measured. She wasn't angry that I didn't want to go. She just didn't want a scene. It's one day, she said that morning. Just show up, be pleasant, and leave it alone. I didn't tell her how every visit to her family's home left me feeling like I was wearing someone else's skin. Too tight, itchy in the wrong places, and definitely not mine. By the time we reached Reuben's estate in Raleigh, the sun was already too high and too hot. The driveway was lined with SUVs, and I counted no fewer than 3 Teslas. There were balloons at the gate. Pink, gold, and white. Harvard colors, I guessed. Even the welcome sign was embroidered. Congratulations, Ivy. The letters curled like they were trying too hard. I stepped out of the car and already felt underdressed. Camille adjusted the collar of my shirt like I was a child, then smiled. Not at me, but the illusion we were expected to maintain. You look fine, she said. Let's just get through this. The moment we crossed the threshold into Reuben's backyard, I remembered why I hated these things. Laughter echoed too loud. Everything smelled like expensive cologne and grilled meat. Lawn chairs were arranged like an award show audience. The pool had floating lanterns. People I barely knew smiled at Camille and nodded politely at me, like I was the plus one. Like I hadn't been married to her for 7 years. Like I didn't belong. Reuben spotted us and waved from across the lawn, drink already in hand. Judith stood near the grill, her posture as regal as ever. She wore a beige suit like she was about to take the podium at a CEO convention. Her eyes met mine, and just for a second, I thought maybe this time she'd say something vaguely warm. But no, her smile was thin, obligatory, and vanished the second Camille hugged her. I kept my distance. Found a quiet corner near the hydrangeas. Poured myself a flat soda into a red cup and tried to pretend I was invisible. Ivy hadn't even noticed us arrive. She was holding court near the patio, surrounded by a small crowd. Harvard sweatshirt, fresh manicure, polished laughter. I tried to remember her as the awkward teenager who used to eat cereal on Camille's floor during sleepovers. That girl was long gone. Camille joined me briefly, her hand brushing mine. Thank you for coming, she whispered. I nodded. Don't thank me yet. She laughed softly. Just keep breathing. I breathed. Slowly. In and out. And watched. That's what I do best. I observe. I listen. I write lectures for students who don't know I once worked construction sites to pay for night classes. I publish papers in journals that Judith would never deign to skim. And I keep my head down because I've learned that some people only look up when they're clapping for themselves. But even knowing that, it still stung when Judith walked over during the toast, all champagne and charm, and said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "We're just so proud of Ivy. She's always aimed high. Some people's husbands are high school dropouts. But thank God, our girl knew her worth." The table chuckled. Not all at once, but enough. Camille stiffened beside me, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. I felt the heat rush to my ears. I looked at Judith. Really looked at her. The way she didn't blink, didn't flinch. She wanted me to take it. To laugh along or walk away. Either response would have given her what she wanted. My silence. But something shifted in me. A quiet line crossed. I didn't say anything then. Not yet. But I tucked the words away like a stone in my pocket. And I smiled. The kind of smile that makes people wonder if they've gone too far. The kind that doesn't fade. Not for hours. I didn't want to go. But now that I was here, maybe silence wasn't the only thing I'd brought with me. Everything at Uncle Ruben's looked like it belonged in a catalog. Not the cheap kind either, the curated sort where every piece of furniture is a statement, and the lighting cost more than my monthly paycheck. The backyard was sprawling, green, and symmetrical in a way that felt unnatural, like the grass had been bullied into obedience. Patio lanterns hung at uniform lengths, casting an amber glow even though the sun was still out. Speakers played soft jazz, just loud enough to remind everyone that someone had paid for ambience. I kept to the edges, near the trees, pretending to examine the hedges while sipping from my red plastic cup. Lemonade. Oversweetened. Artificial. Just like everything else. Camille was making the rounds, smiling, nodding, laughing at stories she'd heard a dozen times. She had this way of fitting in effortlessly with her family, like she belonged in every room they built. I never quite learned how to do that. Not here. From my corner, I could see Judith, my mother-in-law, reigning supreme in the center of a round table lined with silver cutlery and white linen napkins. Her hair was perfectly set, not a single strand out of place. She wore a lavender pantsuit and held her wine glass like it was an extension of her authority. Beside her, like a prince in a coming-of-age drama, sat Ivy, Harvard sweatshirt zipped halfway, high ponytail slicked back, posture poised just enough to make sure every camera found her angles. They were basking in it, the both of them. Judith's eyes scanning the guests like a general counting victories. Ivy soaking in the attention like a sponge dipped in champagne. I watched Camille approach them, holding a tray of skewered shrimp, probably trying to be helpful. Judith didn't even thank her. Just took one, popped it in her mouth, and kept talking. Ivy barely looked up. A waiter passed by with a tray of mini quiches. I took two, partly because I was hungry, mostly because I needed something to do with my hands. The performance was seamless. Judith's voice rose over the rest as she told a story, something about Ivy writing her college essay about perseverance. She spoke about overcoming adversity, Judith said. How hard she worked. How dedicated she's been since she was little. Some kids grow up with so many obstacles, she added, voice thick with self-satisfaction. But our Ivy? She always knew her worth. More claps. More MMMs of agreement. And then, like a knife slipped between ribs, Judith turned her gaze toward me. That smile again, tight and pleasant like a closed door. Some people's husbands are high school dropouts, she said. Her tone didn't change. She said it like it was a punchline, but her eyes never laughed. But Ivy didn't settle. Camille froze. Her fingers clenched at her side. I saw it happen in real time, the shift. The air around the table changed, but not enough to stop the applause. Not enough to make anyone stand up and say, hey, that wasn't okay. Because they weren't surprised. Judith had been doing this for years, digging in, cutting me down, always with that painted-on smile. And every time, I'd let it pass. Every time, I'd swallow the insult, finish my drink, and pretend it didn't sting. But something about today, the setup, the crowd, the polished smugness of Ivy's whole existence, it made that old anger rise like smoke. And for once, I didn't want to be the quiet man in the background. Not today. I set down my cup and stepped forward, just a little. Just enough to be seen. I could feel every eye turned toward me, even though no one stopped clapping. Judith blinked, just once. Ivy tilted her head, like she wasn't sure if I was about to compliment her or correct her. Camille reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. Not yet. I didn't come here to be clapped for, I said, my voice steady. And I didn't drop out of high school. A few heads turned. I finished early. Got a GED before I turned 17. I was working full-time by then. Construction, night shifts, paid my way through community college, graduated, honors. Then Duke gave me a shot. Master's, PhD, tenure track. The table went quiet, finally. I let the silence hang. I don't care if anyone here remembers that. But you should know, I added, turning to Judith. I didn't marry Camille for appearances. And she didn't marry me because she was settling. She married me because I never performed for applause. Judith stared. Her mouth tight, her wine untouched. Camille stood beside me, her eyes soft and wide, like she was watching me for the first time. And Ivy? Well, Ivy just looked confused. I took a breath, exhaled slow, and gave a small nod. Some people chase applause, I said, stepping back. Others do the work. And with that, I picked up my red cup again, returned to the edges of the yard, and let the ivy-clad walls close in around someone else for once. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't puff out my chest or look for a mic to drop. I just let the words settle in the air like slow-falling ash. Funny. I said, lifting the plastic cup of lemonade to my lips. I'm her professor. You could feel the silence take over like a ripple through still water. At first, it was just the people closest to us. Uncle Reuben's wife mid-sip, the guy with the Bluetooth earpiece who kept nodding at everything, even when no one was speaking. Then it spread across the patio like a cold front. Conversation stopped. The music felt distant. Someone's kid dropped a popsicle, and the soft splat on concrete sounded louder than it should have. Judith blinked slowly. I watched her face go from polite confusion to something closer to horror. No, not horror. Exposure. Like a spotlight had hit her square in the chest. Ivy's head whipped toward me, her mouth parted slightly. The Harvard sweatshirt suddenly seemed too tight on her frame, like it was choking her from the inside. Camille was frozen beside me. Her hand hovered near mine, but didn't touch it. I could feel her breath catch in her throat. She looked like she wanted to say something, but I had just appended the whole stage play and torn down the backdrop. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just stood there, still sipping that too-sweet lemonade, as the truth cracked through their little performance like a hairline fracture in glass. Ivy's in my course, I added calmly. Literature in Diaspora. Required class for undergrads in her track. Ivy's face turned red, then pale. She looked like someone had pulled the ground out from beneath her, and for the first time that afternoon, she was no longer center stage. Someone coughed. A chair scraped against the deck. Judith opened her mouth, then closed it. I'd never seen her without words. She'd always had a response, a way to reclaim control of the room. But now, there was none. Just the sound of summer cicadas and the occasional clink of a glass against a coaster. I kept my eyes on Ivy. You registered under your middle name, Lena. I didn't say anything at first. Figured maybe you didn't want the connection known. You didn't act like you knew me. So I let it go. Ivy's arms were crossed tightly over her chest now. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked younger than I'd ever seen her. Like a kid suddenly caught lying with her hand still in the jar. I gave her no special treatment, I said, turning slightly so more people could hear. She earned her grade like everyone else. Late papers. Half-baked arguments. Plenty of room to grow. But she got better. Because she had to. I didn't hand her anything. I looked at Judith again. So maybe this applause, all this celebration, maybe it should be for that. Not for the brand name on a sweatshirt. Not for the illusion of ease. But for the fact that she showed up and got challenged. For the first time, maybe. Camille's hand finally found mine. She squeezed, hard, like an anchor in stormy water. I didn't know if it was gratitude or fear, but I didn't pull away. Are you done? Judith finally said. Her voice was thin, trembling slightly. That regal calm she wore like armor had slipped. She looked smaller now, quieter. I nodded. I am. And just like that, the noise slowly returned. People shifted in their seats. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Ivy walked away first, stiff-legged, like she was trying to hold herself together until she reached somewhere private. Camille whispered something to her mother. I didn't catch it, and then followed me to the edge of the yard. She didn't say anything for a long while. Just stood beside me near the hydrangeas again, eyes downcast. The party had resumed, but the air felt different, like something unspoken had finally been named. You could have told me, she said softly, not accusatory, just tired, that she was in your class. I nodded. I could have. Why didn't you? I thought about it. Because it wasn't about me. Or us. Not then. It was about her learning who she was outside of all this. Camille turned to look at me. And today? I glanced back at the patio, at Judith, who now sat with her arms folded, jaw clenched. Today, it felt like the right moment to remind everyone that real growth doesn't come with a round of applause. She didn't say anything, but her hand never left mine. We stood like that for a while, the two of us, watching the glow of the lanterns flicker as the sun dipped below the line of trees. Somewhere inside, Ivy was probably trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe she'd hate me for it. Maybe she'd understand. Either way, I hadn't come here to win a fight. But I hadn't come to lose one either. They didn't know I taught at Duke. No one in Camille's family ever asked. To them, I was just the man their daughter married instead of the orthopedic surgeon they'd been grooming her for. I was the quiet one at dinners, the guy who brought his own books to the beach house, the man who didn't know the difference between a wine decanter and a centerpiece vase. No one cared enough to ask what I did, and honestly, I stopped offering after the third or fourth gathering. It made last night's silence all the more satisfying. But standing in the garden now, just outside the main event. The memory of it was still pulsing in my chest. Ivy had looked like she'd seen a ghost. Camille hadn't said much when we got home. She stayed quiet in the passenger seat, twisting the ring on her finger the way she always did when her thoughts were louder than her words. We didn't fight. We didn't even debrief. And in a strange way, I was grateful for that. The next morning, I sat on the back porch of our townhouse, coffee in one hand, and let my mind drift back to that first day Ivy walked into my classroom. She'd enrolled as Lena Caldwell, and I almost didn't recognize her. The sharp haircut, the blank expression, the Harvard ambition barely concealed beneath that expensive coat. She didn't look like Camille's little sister anymore. She didn't look like the kid who once asked if she could braid my hair while we waited for Camille to finish laundry. She sat in the back row, didn't make eye contact. When I called attendance and said Lena Caldwell, she raised her hand without flinching. That was our silent agreement. Don't acknowledge the connection. Don't make it weird. And I didn't. I gave her the same syllabus, the same deadlines, the same critical reading list I gave every other student. But Ivy didn't do the same work. Not really. Her first essay was 3 pages of surface-level summaries with a few buzzwords dropped in for decoration. I gave her a C, not because I had something to prove, because it wasn't good. Her comments after class were clipped. "You grade harsh," she said once. Not even harshly, just harsh, like she was still testing the limits of what she could get away with. I remember grading her second paper late one night. It was on Things Fall Apart. The prompt was simple. Analyze the role of colonial language in Achabe's narrative structure. Ivy's response. The characters felt distant because the book was trying too hard to sound important. That was her thesis. I read it 3 times, thinking maybe she was setting up a deeper point. But no, that was it. I gave her a B-. She stormed into office hours that Friday. Same expressionless face, but her voice carried heat. "I know I'm not your favorite, but this is ridiculous," she said, slamming her paper on the desk. "I'd been expecting it. Let's go through it." I replied calmly, and we did. Line by line, point by point. I showed her every vague argument, every unsupported claim, every sentence where she hid behind vague observations instead of real analysis. By the end, she sat back in the chair, arms crossed. "You make it sound like I didn't try." I shrugged. "I'm saying you didn't think." She blinked. "What's the difference?" I looked at her then, not as Camille's sister, not as Judith's golden child, but as a student sitting across from someone who saw through the performance. Trying is doing the work to be seen as smart. Thinking is asking questions even when no one's watching. That landed somewhere deep. I saw it in her posture. She didn't speak for a full minute. Then she asked, "What should I have said about the language?" So we talked. For nearly 40 minutes. Not just about Achebe, but about voice, identity, narrative control. We didn't talk like family. We talked like people trying to figure out the same hard thing. After that, Ivy never mentioned the grades again. But her work changed. Slightly at first, clearer arguments, less filler, but then with more force. Her final paper, on Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, was her best. She didn't try to sound smart. She tried to understand. And that made all the difference. Back in the present, I wandered from our porch to my small home office and pulled open the drawer where I kept some student submissions worth remembering. I kept hers. Not out of sentiment, but because it marked a turning point. For her, maybe. For me, definitely. It was the moment I realized Ivy didn't want an education. Not really. She wanted applause. The kind Judith handed out with champagne and gift bags. The kind you didn't have to earn, just display. A brand-name school, a polished resume, a curated path. But life, real life, doesn't give you a standing ovation for showing up. And it doesn't hand out as for knowing how to sit at the right table. She had to learn that. And somehow, I had to teach it. Quietly, without blowing our cover. I glanced out the window, toward the rows of brick townhouses across the street. I wondered if Ivy had told anyone yet. I doubted it. Secrets like that get folded neatly and stored away in families like hers. But I remembered the look on her face when I said it, when I told them all. I'm her professor. It wasn't pride. It wasn't vengeance. It was the truth, finally spoken aloud. And for the first time, I wasn't the one pretending. I left the party early. Slipped out quietly before the sparklers and speeches and whatever final performance Judith had choreographed. Camille stayed behind, of course she did. That was her world, even if she didn't fit in it anymore. I drove home with the windows halfway down, letting the humid air tangle through my shirt, trying to breathe through the heaviness pressing against my ribs. Our car was parked just under a street lamp, its flickering bulb casting gold and shadow over the windshield like something out of a noir film. I left the door open and just sat there, one foot on the pavement, the other inside the car. The world was quiet, finally. No curated laughter, no subtle digs. Just me and the low hum of crickets chirping in the night. Camille hadn't texted. Not yet. I didn't blame her. I figured that was it. The fallout would come in waves over the next few days. Judith's disapproval, Camille caught in the middle, Ivy retreating into silence. I didn't regret what I'd said, but I knew it was a line drawn in thick ink. I had turned over a rock they'd never wanted exposed to light. I didn't expect a knock on the passenger window. It was light. Hesitant. I turned slowly, expecting Camille. But it was Ivy. No Harvard sweatshirt now. Just a black t-shirt, faded jeans, and her hair tied back in a loose, frizzy bun. She looked stripped of all her armor. Makeup gone. Shoulders slouched. I pressed the unlock button. She opened the door and slid in without asking, like she used to back when she was 15 and curious about everything. She didn't speak at first. Neither did I. We sat in that shared silence for a moment. It wasn't awkward. It was necessary. Like the air between us had to recalibrate. I didn't know who you were, she said at last, staring straight ahead. Not at first. Then I did, and I got scared. Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath. I waited. I thought you were going to tell someone. Call my mom. Make a scene in class. Or, I don't know, fail me to prove a point. I raised an eyebrow. You think that's who I am? She gave a tired smile. I didn't know who you were. I just knew what everyone said. Everyone? I echoed, watching the way her knuckles clenched in her lap. Like Judith. She winced. Like everyone. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I hated your class, she admitted after a beat. At first. I kept thinking, how could someone like you end up at Duke? Teaching literature. I thought it was a fluke. Or a mistake. Or some diversity quota. I nodded. You wouldn't be the first to think that. But then you made me work, she said, almost accusingly. Harder than I've ever had to. And I resented you for that. I couldn't just breeze through with pretty words and fake insights. You called me out. On every paper. Because I knew you could do better. She turned then. Really looked at me. I didn't want to do better. I wanted to be impressive. That landed like a stone in the silence between us. I've been chasing applause for so long, I don't know what it means to actually learn something. Without trying to impress anyone. I watched her. This girl who had once seemed untouchable in that crowd of glitter and judgment. She looked tired now. Honest. Maybe even real. Everyone's proud of me, she continued. They tell me I'm special. Smart. Going places. But the truth is, I don't even know who I am when no one's looking. I let the silence hold her words. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was just finally saying it out loud. I read the feedback you gave me, she said after a long pause. All of it. Not just for the grade, but really read it. The notes in the margins, the suggestions. The way you challenged my assumptions. She turned toward me again. And I realized, you weren't trying to embarrass me. You were trying to make me think. I looked out through the windshield, where a moth circled the flickering light overhead. That's all I've ever wanted, Ivy. For any student. For people to think for themselves. To question what they've been told. She nodded slowly. I guess I just didn't expect that lesson to come from someone who wasn't clapping for me. I smiled faintly. Maybe that's the only place real learning ever comes from. She reached for the door handle, then paused. I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I think I want to figure it out without trying to win the room. That's a good start, I said. She stepped out and closed the door softly. I watched her walk back toward the house, shoulders straighter, steps slower. She wasn't healed. Not yet. But something had shifted. She had stopped performing. And that was more than I ever expected. 2 days passed. No calls. No more visits. Camille and I existed in the same space, but said little. Not in anger, but in that quiet way couples sometimes speak when they're thinking too much and feeling even more. She worked late. I cooked for one. The silence wasn't cold. It was cautious. Then came the email. No subject line. No greeting. Just a sentence in the body. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. Zora Neale Hurston. From the very book I'd assigned in her final paper. Beneath the quote, Ivy had written only a few more lines. No apologies. No explanations. No dramatics. Just honesty, stripped down to the marrow. I reread the Hurston essay last night. The one you marked up. I used to think literature was about sounding smart. Now I think it's about understanding people, including yourself. I'm not sure which year this is for me yet. Maybe it's both. Either way, thank you for not letting me coast. That was it. I read it 3 times before I moved. Then, without really thinking, I stood, walked into my office, and opened the drawer on the left side of my desk. I created a new folder on my desktop titled Unspoken Things, and I dragged her email into it. It wasn't sentimental. Not exactly. I've received thank you notes before from students I barely remember. The kind that start with Dear Professor Talbot and end with some variation of You changed my life. They're flattering, but forgettable. Ivy's was different, because Ivy knew me. Or at least, she'd begun to. She'd seen the version of me that stood apart from the applause. The one who graded in silence. Who pushed harder when students pushed back. Who believed in the hard work of self-discovery, not the theater of self-branding. She'd seen all that, and she was still writing to me. That meant something. I sat back in my chair, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. I thought about replying, but I didn't. Not yet. There was something sacred in the fact that she hadn't written for a response. She had written for herself. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the little-used bookstore 2 blocks from campus, the kind with handwritten labels, uneven shelves, and a grumpy owner named Felix who only perked up when someone mentioned Baldwin or Morrison. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. It was a habit I'd developed in grad school. Wander the aisles, let the spine speak, wait for something to call me over. And then I saw it. A worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Dog-eared. Notes in the margins. The same edition I'd used in class. The same one Ivy had referenced in her email. I flipped through the pages, and there it was, page 112, underlined in fading blue ink. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. I smiled and bought it without hesitation. Back home, I placed the book on my desk, then opened to that same page. I printed Ivy's email and folded it neatly, sliding it between the pages like a letter never meant to be mailed. Not every truth needs to be sent. Some are meant to be kept. That evening, Camille returned home just as the sky started to turn gold. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes not from work, but from carrying too many unspoken thoughts. I waited until she poured herself a glass of water, then spoke. I got an email, I said quietly. She turned. From Ivy. I nodded. Her expression shifted, relief, worry, maybe even curiosity all tangled together. Is she okay? I paused. She's thinking. Camille sank into the chair across from me. That's new. I slid the folded email across the table. She didn't open it. She just placed her hand on it, gently, like it was something fragile. We sat like that for a while. No arguments. No, I told you so's. Just space. Honest and undemanding. She looked different that night, Camille finally said. When she came home. Quieter. She stopped performing, I murmured. At least for a moment. Camille's eyes met mine. And you? I thought about it. About the years I'd spent biting my tongue at family gatherings, about the quiet shame of being treated like a tolerated mistake, about the relief that came with finally speaking. I stopped waiting, I said. For what? To be clapped for. Camille reached for my hand, her fingers tracing the line of my knuckles like she was remembering the shape of something familiar. And in that quiet moment, no applause, no crowd, no judgment, I felt the stillness settle around us like a truth too big to say out loud. Something had changed. Not everything, but enough. It crept up like it always did, quietly, slowly, like an old ache you think you've outrun until it settles back into your bones. Camille and I didn't speak much during the drive to her Aunt Beatrice's place. The roads were mostly empty, just cracked asphalt and brown leaning trees, their leaves barely clinging on. I kept my hands on the wheel, eyes forward. Camille stared out the window, arms folded, lips pursed, not in anger, but in thought. No one had brought up the reunion. Not directly. Judith hadn't called. Ivy hadn't followed up on the email. Camille had only said, they're doing dinner at Beatrice's this year. We don't have to stay long. I'd nodded. No fight. No resistance. Because we both knew Thanksgiving with her family was never about thanks. It was about performance. Presence. Being seen, evaluated, ranked. Even the cranberry sauce came with a side of judgment. Beatrice's house was bigger than Reuben's. Less flashy, more curated. Cream-colored walls, gold-framed portraits, a baby grand piano no one played except when guests were over. The smell of roasted turkey hung in the air like a cloud. We arrived just as Sasha was gushing about her bakery expansion, and Marlon was boasting about his new promotion. Everyone clapped, the way they always did, on cue, with polished smiles and glasses half raised in rehearsed awe. Camille disappeared into the kitchen to help. I stayed near the archway between the foyer and the dining room, back straight, hands in my pockets, reminding myself to breathe. One holiday, just one. Then I could go home and sit with a book, something honest, something that didn't ask me to smile through gritted teeth. Dinner was served around a long mahogany table that could have doubled as a United Nations summit desk. Silverware gleamed under the chandelier. There were place cards this year. Mine said Dr. or Ian Talbot, in Judith's handwriting. I stared at it for a moment longer than I meant to. A new nameplate on the same old seat. Uncle Reuben gave his usual toast, thanking everyone for coming, cracking a joke about how the stuffing didn't burn this time. Laughter rippled through the table. Then came the usual round-robin of affirmations. Sasha's bakery, Marlon's promotion, Beatrice's youngest finally getting her braces off. Each moment punctuated by a little chorus of so proud, and amazing, and just brilliant. Then Judith stood. Her timing was perfect, as always. She waited until the turkey had been carved, until the clinking of forks had quieted, until all eyes naturally drifted toward the woman who still commanded a room like a trial attorney with no opposing counsel. "We're just so proud of Ivy," she began. I froze mid-chew. "She's doing beautifully at Harvard," Judith continued. "Was recently invited to co-lead a seminar this spring. Quite an achievement." Camille stiffened across from me. I felt her foot press lightly against mine under the table. Then Judith looked directly at me, her tone still warm, sweetened with just enough sugar to burn. "And of course," she said, lifting her glass slightly, "all this excellence runs in the family. Her brother-in-law used to teach, right?" I didn't blink. Didn't look away. Used to. Like tenure was a rumor. Like my name wasn't on the course catalog. Like the quiet truth I'd spoken at the reunion was something she could erase with a single offhand remark. Camille's eyes flicked to me. She knew. She was waiting. Not for a fight, but for a choice. I set down my fork, took a sip of water. Then I reached into my bag. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a performance. I just reached down, unzipped the side pocket, and pulled out the printed journal article. A recent issue of the Southern Literary Review. Ivy's name bolded at the top of the essay. And beneath it, in small, clean print, faculty advisor, Dr. Orion Talbot. I slid it across the table. No speech. No flourish. Just truth, paper-bound and undeniable. Judith's eyes narrowed as she read the heading. Her lips parted just slightly, but she said nothing. "I still teach," I said quietly, my voice calm. "Got tenure last spring. Ivy was my student. I pushed her. She earned this, but not for the reasons you think. Silence. But not the uncomfortable kind. This time, it was different. This time, it was clarity. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for applause. I just let the truth do what it always does when given room. Settle." Marlon leaned forward, peering at the paper. "Damn," he muttered, a little too loud. "Didn't know you published." I offered a small nod. No smile. Judith finally set down her glass. She didn't speak for the rest of dinner. Camille reached for my hand across the table, her touch light but firm. For the first time in that house, I felt grounded, not tolerated, not observed. Just real. Present. The rest of the meal passed in low murmurs and quieter laughter. Ivy wasn't there. She was spending Thanksgiving on campus, supposedly, but I had a feeling she knew this moment would come. And maybe she didn't need to be there for it. Maybe she had her own table now. One without place cards. One where the truth didn't need to be polished before being served. When dessert came, no one clapped. And honestly, it was the best moment of the night. The weight of the moment didn't fade as dessert was cleared. If anything, it lingered, settled into the polished walls and satin seat cushions like it had always belonged there, but had never been invited in. No one said it outright, but everyone knew something had shifted. Judith, usually the loudest voice in the room, was quiet. Not sullen, not dramatic, just silenced. And in that silence, the power she wielded so effortlessly began to unravel. After dinner, the family spread out. Some wandered into the living room, where Beatrice had set up a small piano playlist and a tray of pumpkin-spiced nonsense. Others gravitated to the patio with wine glasses, nursing their pride and pretending nothing had been broken. I stayed at the table, nursing a lukewarm coffee and staring at the untouched slice of pecan pie on my plate. Camille sat beside me, her hand still resting lightly on mine. She hadn't said much since the printout, but the way her fingers stayed there, anchored and warm, told me more than any words could. We didn't need to rehash it. We'd lived it, and we'd survived it together. I glanced at the spot where I'd placed Ivy's academic journal article. It was still there, untouched, the glossy pages lying open like an undeniable truth. The title of her essay, Invisible Ink, The Literature of Hidden Lives, caught the overhead light, the reflection dancing over the tablecloth. I smiled faintly. I remembered that essay. Remembered the hours she spent refining it, the drafts she'd grudgingly rewritten after I'd torn them apart with red ink and margin notes. What no one at that table knew, what Judith especially didn't know, was that Ivy hadn't just written that paper. She'd bled through it. She'd asked questions I never expected her to. She'd explored race, class, gender, invisibility, and Black literature not as abstract ideas, but as lived experiences she'd only recently begun to recognize within herself. Her first draft was academic fluff. Well-written, but shallow. Safe. The kind of paper meant to impress. But I'd called her out on it. I'd written in the margin, "Who are you writing this for? Them or yourself?" A week later, she brought in a new draft. And this time, she wrote like someone who was finally telling the truth. That version, the raw, honest, unpolished one, was what I helped her shape into something worthy of publication. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the muffled hum of voices from the other rooms. Judith was probably somewhere rerouting the evening, patching the seams of her control. But something in me had shifted for good. No more shrinking. No more swallowing dignity to keep the peace. Camille finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to bring that," she said quietly, nodding toward the paper. "I know. But you did." I nodded. "Because I'm tired of letting people rewrite my story." She gave a soft hum. Thoughtful. "You didn't do it for them." It wasn't tucked inside a shiny envelope or accompanied by a stamped crest. No university letterhead. No fancy cursive. Just a plain white envelope, hand-addressed, with my name written in clean, deliberate strokes. Ivy's handwriting. I knew it instantly. The way she curled her lowercase t like Camille did when she was nervous. The way the lines of her K always tilted slightly to the left. It sat in the mailbox among bills, alumni flyers, and a coupon from the hardware store that I would probably never use. I stared at it for a second, longer than I needed to, then slipped it into my back pocket and walked inside. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I made coffee, stirred in too much cream, sat by the window in the kitchen and watched a neighbor's cat slink across our front lawn like it paid rent there. I kept telling myself I wasn't stalling, that I was just preparing. But I knew better. Ivy had already said so much without saying much at all. This letter, whatever it held, felt like the final note in a song that had been building for months. When I finally opened it, the first thing I noticed was that it wasn't formatted like a formal letter. No greeting. No, "Dear Orion." Just a single sentence, written right at the top of the page. "I'm not afraid to start over anymore." I let the words settle before reading on. She wrote about switching her major, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. She said she wanted to pursue education. Not the performative kind. Not the networking, ladder-climbing, prestige-chasing path her mother had plotted since she was old enough to memorize multiplication tables. But real education. Human learning. The kind that digs in slowly and plants itself where identity lives. "I want to teach," she wrote. "Not because I have answers, but because I've finally learned how to ask better questions." That line hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the sort of sentence a person writes for applause. It was quiet, honest, and it told me more about her than any GPA or seminar award ever could. She told me she reread Hurston again, this time without highlighter pens or the goal of sounding insightful. She just read, sat with the words, let them do what they were meant to do, move her. "You taught me more than anyone clapping ever did," she wrote, "because you didn't let me hide. You didn't let me coast. You saw me, even when I was trying to disappear into expectations." I read that part twice, maybe 3 times. She ended the letter with a line that I would remember long after the ink faded. "Whatever I become next, it'll be because someone dared to see the version of me that wasn't already polished." There was no signature. No "Love, Ivy." No postscript. Just the letter. Just the truth. I folded it gently and carried it into my study. On my shelf, second row from the bottom, sat an old used copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God. I'd found it years ago in a thrift store bin, the cover half torn, its pages scribbled with someone else's notes. But I kept it. not just because of Hurston's words, but because it reminded me that literature lives longer when it's marked up, lived in, questioned. I flipped to the dog-eared page. There it was again, that quote Ivy had used in her email. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. I slipped her letter into that exact spot. And I stood there for a while, just breathing. It wasn't closure. I didn't want it to be. It was continuation. Growth. The slow, steady kind that doesn't make noise or demand recognition. Later that evening, Camille found me on the back porch, a throw blanket draped over her shoulders. She carried a cup of tea and 2 folded napkins, one tucked under a slice of warm apple tart. I gestured to the empty chair beside me. She sat, passed me the dessert, and took a sip from her mug. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Got a letter from Ivy." Camille looked at me carefully. "Good news." "The best," I said. "She's starting over. On her terms this time." Camille smiled faintly, her fingers wrapped around the mug like it was something delicate. "She needed that. She needed to feel seen," I said. "And now she does." The wind rustled the branches above us. A few leaves skittered across the porch boards. For a while, we didn't say anything else. We just sat there, eating tart in the quiet, wrapped in something that felt very close to peace. I leaned back and looked up at the stars cutting through the dark like pinholes in a curtain. I thought about the version of Ivy I'd met on the first day of class. Thought about the one who knocked on my car window. And the one who sent a letter without any fanfare. She wasn't afraid anymore. And somehow, neither was I. The air on campus felt different that morning. Not in any dramatic way. There were no grand signs or confetti or anthems playing. But in the subtle way only a familiar place can shift after something inside you has changed. The bricks of the pathway still curved the same. The lecture halls still buzzed with the chaos of late students and overstuffed backpacks. But I walked slower. Not out of fatigue. Just peace. It was a Wednesday. My first class wasn't until 11, but I came early anyway, as I always did. Habit. I liked the quiet before the rustle. I liked unlocking my office door, turning on the small desk lamp, and watching the room go from shadow to soft glow. I liked the shelves lined with too many books and the coffee maker that sputtered more than it brewed. And on this particular morning, I liked myself a little more than I usually did. The last few months had been full, heavy with truths. Ivy's transformation. Judith's silence. Camille's quiet presence as we sorted through the fallout of old wounds and unspoken resentments. Nothing exploded. No dramatic separations. Just space. Room to breathe. A subtle untangling of expectation from reality. I stepped into my classroom and stood for a moment, just looking. The chairs were arranged in a horseshoe, like always. I'd never liked the rigid grid rows, made everyone feel like they were waiting to be judged. In my classroom, we faced each other. We spoke, we listened, we learned as a circle, not a hierarchy. When students began to file in, I greeted them with nods, a few quiet hellos. I opened my notebook, but didn't flip it open right away. I looked out over the class, young faces, some eager, some half asleep, some pretending to be either. And I realized I didn't need to impress them. I didn't need them to clap at the end of a lecture or to quote me back on their exams. I just wanted them to think. I began the lesson not with slides or reading, but with a question. What's something you used to believe, but don't anymore? The room shifted. Some blinked. Some smiled nervously. One student in the back adjusted his hoodie like he could disappear into it. I let the silence hold. I learned its power. Not all questions are meant to be filled quickly. Finally, a voice near the window said, "I used to believe the smartest person in the room always had to speak the most." Another student chimed in. "I used to think failure meant I wasn't good enough. Now I think it just means I needed a different approach." I nodded. "Good. Keep going." For 40 minutes, we didn't open a textbook. We didn't quote anyone famous. We just talked. About assumptions, about growth, about how easy it is to perform intelligence instead of actually pursuing it. And when the class ended, no one clapped. They just gathered their things a little more slowly than usual. One or two lingered. One said thank you. That was enough. Later that afternoon, I returned home. Camille was in the kitchen, barefoot, scrolling through a recipe on her phone. She looked up when I walked in and smiled, a tired, genuine smile that reached her eyes. No tension. No rehearsed greetings. Just her. "Long day?" she asked. "No," I said, stepping over to her. "Good day." She handed me a spoon with something warm on it. Sweet. Spiced. Apple and ginger, maybe. Trying something new. I like it. We moved around each other with the ease of people who had once tangled in silence but now knew the rhythm of peace. We didn't talk about Thanksgiving, or Ivy, or Judith. We didn't have to. That season had passed, but its lessons had settled inside us like slow-growing roots. After dinner, I stepped out onto the back porch with a blanket and a book. Not a syllabus, not an academic journal, just something to read for the sake of reading. The wind rustled the leaves in our small yard. The sky above was clear, the stars quiet and unbothered. I opened the book and let the spine crack softly. Inside, tucked neatly between 2 pages, was Ivy's letter. I read it again. Still no greeting. Still no sign-off. Still perfect. Behind me, the door creaked open. Camille stepped out, holding 2 mugs of tea. She handed me one and sat beside me, her knee brushing mine. She didn't ask what I was reading. I didn't offer to explain. We sat like that, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in the kind of silence that doesn't ask for more than what is already here. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't trying to prove anything. Not to her. Not to Judith. Not even to myself. I wasn't clapping for anyone. And I wasn't waiting to be clapped for. I was just being seen. Finally. On my own terms.